The first laugh came just as the woman's bad leg nearly gave way on the wet pavement, and the sound was so sharp in the cold morning air that even the flag above the parade ground seemed to stiffen. She did not fall. She caught herself with one hand against the low concrete wall, lowered her eyes, and kept moving with that uneven, stubborn step that made three fresh-faced soldiers at the edge of formation smirk like boys who still believe pain only belonged to old stories. One of them copied her limp. Another muttered something about the wrong gate and the wrong place. The third laughed hardest of all, until she turned slightly, and for one strange second, something in her face made even him hesitate. She looked like someone who had already survived the kind of mourning that ruined other people for life. Before I tell you what happened next, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Let me know in the comments. I always enjoy seeing people from around the world joining these stories. If stories about courage, sacrifice, and humanity inspire you, consider subscribing and becoming part of this community. She wore no uniform now. That was the first thing they judged. A dark wool coat, plain black slacks, sensible shoes that still weren't enough to hide the drag in her left leg. Her hair was pulled back with the kind of care people use when they want to look composed and have already lost the energy to look young. In one hand, she carried a worn leather folder with a cracked zipper. In the other, she held an old patrol cap so faded by time that its original shade of camouflage had softened into memory. The recruits knew nothing about her, but arrogance has never needed facts to feel confident. Private Tyler Beck was the one who had mimicked her. 19, broad-shouldered, eager to be noticed, and still carrying that dangerous new soldier mixture of pride and insecurity that made cruelty feel like confidence. He had spent 8 weeks learning how to move in formation, how to strip a rifle, how to make his face blank when a sergeant barked in it. He had not spent 1 hour learning what scars looked like when they stopped bleeding. "She's gonna miss bingo," he muttered under his breath. The soldier beside him snorted. The third looked away too late to hide that he'd laughed too. The woman heard every word. She kept walking toward the administration building at the far end of the parade ground, where a brass plaque beside the entrance caught a sliver of thin winter light. Records Review, Personnel Affairs, Honors, and Archive Division. It was an ordinary doorway for an extraordinary kind of fear. She had stood under rotor wash, heard metal scream, pressed both hands against torn flesh while rounds cracked through smoke, and yet the sight of that glass door made her chest tighten harder than any battlefield memory. Because behind that door was the one thing she had spent 12 years both wanting and dreading. Her file. Not the public version. Not the short, sanitized service record with dates, medical discharge codes, and a few commendations printed in flat bureaucratic language. This was the sealed one. The classified jacket. The one with the blacked-out pages. The one the Army had finally agreed to reopen after enough time, enough signatures, and enough dead men had become names carved into stone instead of secrets held in locked cabinets. She had told herself she came for closure. The truth was uglier than that. She had come to find out whether the worst night of her life had made her a hero, a fool, or the reason one good man never made it home. By the time she reached the door, the pain had climbed from her hip into the base of her spine. It always did when the weather turned damp. Nerve damage did not care about dignity. It arrived without permission and stayed without apology. She paused with one hand on the handle, feeling the old ache pulse through the titanium pins that doctors had sworn she would eventually stop noticing. She had never stopped noticing. Inside, the building smelled faintly of paper, floor polish, and old heat. Somewhere down the corridor, a printer clicked. Boots moved briskly on tile. Voices stayed low the way they always did near records, as if paper itself deserved silence. A corporal behind the reception desk looked up and started to ask if she needed help, but the woman had already spoken. "Elena Mercer," she said softly. "I was told to report at 0800. The corporal's expression changed before she even finished. Not to recognition. Few people recognized her anymore, but to a trained kind of caution. He checked the schedule, straightened in his chair, and reached for the phone. "Yes, ma'am. Colonel Pierce is expecting you." The title struck her like a hand against old bruises. Pierce. So he had come himself. She had not seen Colonel Rowan Pierce in 12 years. Not since he was Captain Pierce and bleeding through a tourniquet while insisting that she get on the extraction bird without him. Back then he had been younger than he looked, too calm under fire, the kind of officer who spoke quietly enough that men leaned in to hear him. Now, when he stepped into the corridor and saw her standing under the dim fluorescent lights, he stopped as if time had physically met him halfway. He had more gray at the temples now. The lines around his eyes had deepened. Command had carved its price into his face, just as war had carved itself into hers. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he said the only thing that mattered. "You came." Elena gave the smallest nod. "I almost didn't." "I know." He stepped forward, and though his instinct was clearly to offer his arm, he did not. That, more than any greeting, told her he remembered who she had been before pain made every staircase an argument. "I appreciate this," he said. "I know what it cost you to walk back onto a post." She almost laughed at that, not because it was wrong, because it was incomplete. The cost had begun years before she touched that gate. It had started with the helicopter door refusing to close because too many wounded men were packed inside, with sand and blood mixing beneath her knees. With Captain Mason Reed shouting over the engine noise while fire chewed through the edge of the compound wall. With one order, one refusal, one decision that still woke her at 3 in the morning with her fists clenched against the sheets. Instead, she only asked, "Is it here?" Pierce looked toward the closed conference room at the end of the hall. "Yes. Some sections are still restricted. Some were released last week. The review board approved partial disclosure to you and to the Reed family." He paused. "There's also something else." Her throat tightened. "If this is about a ceremony, Rowan, don't." He glanced toward the window overlooking the parade ground, where fresh soldiers stood in neat lines under a sky turning the color of cold steel. "There's an oath and recognition event this afternoon. Families are coming. The commanding general will be here." He brought his eyes back to hers. "Your file isn't just being opened. Your record is being corrected." That frightened her more than the file itself. "I didn't come for a medal." "No," he said gently. "You came for the truth." Outside, on the parade ground, Sergeant First Class Boone was walking the new soldiers through the same turn for the third time because one end of the formation kept drifting out of line. He was a hard man with a bark like gravel and the weary instincts of someone who had trained too many young men not to know exactly which ones were hiding immaturity behind discipline. He had not heard Tyler Beck's joke, but he had seen the laughter, and he had seen something else. The woman with the limp. He had seen the way Colonel Pierce himself had come down to meet her. By the time Boone turned back toward the formation, Tyler was still wearing the kind of grin people regret later. "Beck," Boone snapped. The grin vanished. "You find something funny out here?" "No, Sergeant." "Good. Because after final rehearsal, you and the two geniuses next to you are reporting to archive detail. Since you've got energy to spare, you can spend it carrying boxes for people who actually earned the right to be here." The recruits answered in unison. Tyler's jaw tightened. Humiliation prickled under his skin, not enough to change him yet, but enough to make him remember her face. Inside, Elena followed Colonel Pierce to a small waiting room with 2 metal chairs, a coffee maker humming in the corner, and one narrow window overlooking the memorial lawn. Beyond the glass stood a row of black granite panels engraved with names. Soldiers crossed that lawn every day without stopping. Families never passed it quickly. Pierce offered coffee. She declined. "You should know," he said, standing rather than sitting. "Claire Reed is here." The room seemed to lose air. Elena stared at him. "Why?" She asked to be. That was somehow worse. Claire. Mason Reed's widow had been 26 when the casualty officers came to her door. She had a 2-year-old son then, and a wedding ring she would not remove for months. Elena had written her 6 letters over the years and mailed none of them. There had never seemed to be a sentence clean enough for the truth. How do you tell a woman that her husband died because you disobeyed an order? How do you tell her he died helping you save others? How do you tell her you are alive because he spent his last strength making sure you kept moving? Elena rose too fast, pain flashing through her hip. "I can't do that." Pierce took one step toward her. "You don't have to see anyone until you're ready." "There is no ready." He let that sit between them. From the parade ground outside came the distant rhythm of boots striking pavement in unison. Left, right, left. That sound had once meant purpose. Then it had meant memory. Now it meant both, and she hated that it still reached inside her so easily. "I should have stayed in the car," she murmured. "But you didn't." She looked at the memorial through the narrow window. "That's never been my problem." It had not. Elena Mercer had never been good at staying where fear suggested. That was part of what ruined her life. It was also the reason 8 men came home. At 24, she had been a combat medic attached to a special operations aviation support team. Good under pressure, reckless in ways no one noticed until it mattered, and stubborn enough to ignore pain if someone else needed her hands. She had not been the loudest in a room. She had not chased glory. She had simply become the person people called when everything had already gone wrong. Those people trusted her because she moved toward blood, not away from it. But trust can become its own burden. On the night that followed her into every year after, a surveillance team had gone dark during an extraction in bad terrain. Intelligence was compromised. Weather was turning. Communications were breaking up. By the time Elena's aircraft reached the area, the mission had already begun to fold in on itself. The down team was scattered. One transport was disabled. The safe exfil route was gone. There were wounded men in a half-collapsed mud compound, an interpreter bleeding near the doorway, and a little girl hiding under a broken table because nobody had time to tell her the adults were terrified. Most of that would still be blacked out in the file. What would not be blacked out, what Elena had spent 12 years avoiding, was the choice. When Captain Pierce ordered final extraction, one man was still inside that compound with Mason Reed. Elena had not obeyed. A knock on the door pulled her back into the waiting room. A young specialist stepped in. "Sir, the review team is ready." Pierce looked at Elena. He did not ask if she wanted another minute. He knew better. A different kind of kindness lived in that restraint. The conference room was too bright. Long table. 2 civilian analysts. 1 judge advocate officer. A digital recorder resting beside a thick records jacket stamped with layered labels, restricted, compartmented, medical addendum, award review. Portions of the cover had been reissued, but beneath the fresh paper, she could still see the shadow of older red stamps, the kind meant to keep history inside a vault. Her name sat there in black block letters. Mercer, Elena J. For a moment she couldn't sit. The file looked heavier than paper should. One of the analysts explained the process in careful, bloodless language. Some sections had been declassified in full. Others had redactions to protect sources and methods. She could pause at any point. She could request copies of approved pages. Audio transcripts had been converted to text. Medical imagery had been removed unless requested. Elena barely heard him. All she could see was the jacket. Not because it contained secrets, because it contained judgment. She had lived long enough to know that memory lies. It softens some things, exaggerates others, builds altars out of guilt, carves prisons out of uncertainty. There were nights she could still feel Mason Reed's blood on her hands so clearly that she would stand at her bathroom sink scrubbing fingers that had been clean for more than a decade. There were mornings she woke convinced she had invented his last words because the real ones were too painful to remember. Now the army was about to tell her what actually happened. Pierce slid the file toward her. Her hand trembled before it touched the cover. On the parade ground, the morning rehearsal ended. Families had begun to arrive in small clusters for the afternoon event. Parents holding phones, children in pressed clothes, old veterans moving carefully across the lawn with canes or stiff knees that matched the weather. Tyler Beck spotted them all with the detached impatience of a young soldier who still thought ceremonies existed mainly to inconvenience him. Archive detail irritated him more. He and the other 2 recruits were sent to the administration building under a specialist who barely looked older than they were. They carried sealed boxes of service records from storage to the review office, stacking them against one wall while civilians checked serial numbers. At first Tyler grumbled under his breath. Then he saw the woman again. She was seated through the glass of a conference room, shoulders rigid, one hand pressed over her mouth. A colonel standing beside her like a witness at a graveside. On the table in front of her lay an open file dense with black bars and official seals. Even from a distance, it looked different from the ordinary records they had been hauling. Not cleaner, more dangerous, like a thing that had spent years locked away from sunlight. Tyler slowed without meaning to. The specialist snapped, eyes front Beck. He jerked his head back. Yes, specialist. But curiosity, once lit, rarely obeys orders either. Inside the conference room, Elena turned the first page. Service chronology, deployment dates, medical certification, attached duty status, operational attachment, redacted, injury summary, pelvic fracture, nerve trauma, Surgical reconstruction. Medical retirement. That part she knew. The next pages were witness statements. Captain Rowan Pierce. Sergeant Mason Reed. Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Sloan. Two names she recognized. One she had not spoken aloud in years. The room grew quieter than silence. She started with Pierce's statement because she could not yet face Mason's. The language was formal, but the truth pressed through it anyway. Under hostile conditions, Staff Sergeant Mercer moved between casualties despite repeated exposure. Refused extraction after lawful command was issued. Re-entered unstable structure to retrieve isolated personnel. Provided trauma care while under direct fire. Shielded civilian minor during breach collapse. Sustained catastrophic injury during secondary blast. Continued evacuation efforts until loss of consciousness. Lawful command. Refused extraction. The word sat there without mercy. Elena's jaw tightened. There it was. The stain she had carried alone. Not imagined. Not dramatized by guilt. Written in ink by the army itself. She leaned back, shut her eyes, and for one moment she was no longer in the conference room. She was in mud and smoke. Mason shouting her name from inside the compound. The interpreter screaming that his daughter was still there. Pierce over the headset ordering them out because the wall was about to go. The choice arriving all at once and not feeling like a choice at all. Go back for one more life and risk losing everyone. Leave and spend the rest of your life hearing the one voice you abandoned. She had gone back. If there was a clean answer in that moment, she had never found it. When she opened her eyes again, the page had blurred. I disobeyed, she said, her voice barely stronger than breath. Pierce did not argue. Yes. The honesty hurt. Then he added, and if you had obeyed me, 9 people would be dead. Her eyes lifted to his. He said it without drama, without softening, like a fact he had spent years waiting to place where it belonged. The judge advocate across the table looked down, giving them privacy inside a room that technically had none. Elena swallowed. Mason. Pierce nodded once. She turned the page. Mason Reed's statement had been recorded during medical stabilization, 4 hours after extraction. Before internal bleeding took him into surgery, he never survived. The transcript preserved his words exactly, including false starts, broken phrasing, and the medic's note that he was intermittently conscious. Elena had expected military language. Procedure. Summary. Instead, she found him. Mercer heard the kid. That was the first line. Elena stopped breathing. The statement continued in fragments. Couldn't leave the girl. Told her to go. She didn't. Good. Damn stubborn. Saved Pierce. Saved Sloan. Saved me time. If they question her, that's on me. I stayed too. We all made the call when we went in. Then came the line that broke something open inside her. If Mercer blames herself, tell her she was the reason the rest of us saw daylight again. Elena stared at the words until they doubled. Across the table, one of the civilian analysts quietly pushed a box of tissues toward her and said nothing. She hated crying in front of strangers. Hated how grief made the body small. Hated how years of composure could be undone by a sentence from a dead man who had understood her better in his final hour than she had understood herself for 12 years. Mason had a son, she said, not looking up. He's here, Pierce replied. He asked to meet you. Pain hit harder in her leg then, as if the body, sensing the wall in her chest cracking, had decided to remind her it still held its own history too. She pressed her palm into her thigh until the flare subsided. The next pages revealed the award review that had been frozen under classification. Recommendation for the Silver Star. Delayed. Escalated. Reconsidered. Operational sensitivity. Non-disclosure. Subsequent medical separation prior to public action. There were signatures from officers long retired, annotations from committees, and one final memorandum added just weeks ago after a declassification board had concluded that public harm no longer outweighed historical correction. Historical correction. As if 12 lost years could be amended by better paperwork. Still, one line near the bottom made her throat tighten again. Recommendation. Public recognition not solely for valor under fire, but for refusal to abandon wounded personnel and civilian dependent despite grave personal risk. Civilian dependent. The little girl under the broken table. Elena had wondered for years if she had survived. That question had gnawed at her in the quiet spaces grief left behind. There, tucked into an appendix note, was the answer. Evacuated alive. Released to remaining family. Identity protected. She closed her eyes. Somewhere outside, a bugle call drifted faintly over the lawn. Not everything had been lost. When the review paused, Pierce stepped out to take a call, leaving Elena alone long enough to stand by the window and steady herself. The memorial lawn below looked different now. More families. More soldiers. A breeze pushing the flags harder. She could see 3 recruits crossing toward the loading area with archive boxes in their arms. One of them was Tyler Beck. He looked smaller when he wasn't laughing. He also looked young enough to have no idea that a single careless moment can follow a person much longer than the joke that caused it. He glanced up as if he felt her gaze, and for a second their eyes met through the glass. He looked away first. Shame, unlike arrogance, arrives quietly. The knock on the door this time was softer. A woman stood there in a navy coat, both hands wrapped around the strap of her purse like she needed something to hold on to. She had the posture of someone who had taught herself over the years how to move without breaking in public. Her hair was shorter now, her face older, but Elena knew her immediately. Claire Reed. No room in the world felt large enough in that moment. The analyst asked if Elena wanted privacy. She nodded. When the room emptied, neither woman spoke right away. They stood 6 feet apart with 12 years between them, and the silence carried more truth than most apologies ever could. Claire's eyes were red at the edges, but steady. Elena's hands had gone cold. "I wrote to you," Elena said at last. "A lot of times." Claire gave the faintest, saddest smile. "I guessed. I never sent them." "I guessed that too." Elena tried to find the next sentence and failed. Everything sounded either too small or unforgivable. Claire spared her. "I used to be angry with you," she said, and the honesty landed gently, which made it hurt more. "Not because I thought you got Mason killed. Because I needed somewhere to put the part of me that couldn't accept he was gone." Elena lowered her eyes. Claire continued, voice unsteady but controlled. "Then Rowan came to see us years ago. He couldn't tell us everything then, but he told me enough to know Mason died doing what he believed in. And he told me one thing I never forgot." She swallowed. "He said Mason's last clear thought wasn't fear. It was making sure you got home." Elena's mouth trembled before any tears did. "I didn't," she whispered. "Not really." Claire stepped closer. "I know." That kindness nearly undid her. From her purse, Claire removed a small object wrapped in tissue paper. Inside was a watch with a cracked face and a worn canvas strap. "Mason was wearing this when he deployed," Claire said. "It stopped the day he died. Our son kept it for years. This morning, he said it belongs with the person who was there." Elena stared at it, but did not reach out. "I don't deserve that." Claire's chin lifted, not in anger, but resolve. "That's the problem, Elena. You've been living like punishment is the same thing as loyalty." Those words entered the room and stayed there. Outside, the afternoon gathered itself. Clouds thickened. The kind of cold that makes old injuries speak grew sharper. Soldiers adjusted formation markers. Families took seats under the reviewing stand. Somewhere a child laughed too loudly and got shushed by 3 adults at once. Flags snapped against their poles. Boots moved. Commands echoed. Ceremony was coming, as inevitable as weather. Tyler Beck and the other recruits were stacking the last archive boxes when the specialist handed him a sealed records jacket. "Take this to Colonel Pierce at the reviewing stand. Both hands. Don't bend it." Tyler looked down. The cover was darker than the others and marked with bold bands and clipped tabs. Redactions showed through the paper edges like shadows. Across the front, beneath several official stamps, was the name. Mercer, Elena J. Award Review. Medical Addendum. Restricted Operational Attachment. His throat went dry. The woman with the limp. The woman he had mocked. The specialist had already turned away. Tyler carried the file more carefully than anything he had touched all week. He told himself it was because of the classification markings. Because losing it would end him. Because Boone would skin him alive if he dropped it. But under those excuses was something simpler and more unsettling. He wanted to know who she was. Not the version his joke had invented. The real one. He was still a young man, though, and young men do foolish things when curiosity meets guilt. As he crossed the corridor toward the exit, the wind from an opening door lifted the top page just enough for his eyes to catch one line before he forced himself to look away. Recommendation for valor under direct hostile fire. His feet slowed. Another page shifted, just a little. enough to reveal black bars across paragraphs and a casualty list with more names than he wanted to count. He stopped walking altogether. Boone's voice hit him from behind like a slap. "Move, Beck." Tyler snapped forward and gripped the file harder. By the time he reached the reviewing stand, his face had gone pale. Elena had intended to leave before the ceremony began. That had been the plan she kept rebuilding every few minutes. Finish the review. Avoid the crowd. Avoid the general. Avoid the public correction of a history she had spent years burying in private. But plans built out of fear usually fail at the first moment they are tested. This one failed when she saw Mason Reed's son. He was 14 now, taller than she expected, carrying his father's eyes and his mother's restraint. He stood near Claire in a dark jacket, both hands shoved into his pockets as if he wasn't sure what to do with them. When Claire touched his arm and nodded toward Elena, he walked over slowly, the way people approach graves or truths they've heard about all their lives and never actually seen. "Ma'am," he said. "No accusation. No anger. Just uncertainty." "You don't have to call me that," Elena managed. He glanced at the limp she could never fully hide, then back to her face. "Mom told me you were there." Elena nodded once. He swallowed. Was he scared? The question split her open because it was the one no file could answer completely, and the one every family deserves answered honestly. She thought of Mason in that compound, breath ragged, still shoving another wounded man toward the doorway while the wall shook around them. "He was worried about everybody else," she said. "That's the truth." The boy looked down, blinking hard. "And you?" he asked. Elena did not answer immediately. The easiest response would have been brave, clean, noble. It also would have been false. "Yes," she said at last. "I was terrified." He looked up again, and something in his face softened. That was the moment Elena understood what fear does when spoken plainly. It stops being shame. It becomes proof that courage costs something. The ceremony assembled under a sky-threatening rain. Fresh soldiers in OCP uniforms and tan boots stood in straight lines across the parade ground. Families gathered beneath the reviewing stand wrapped in coats and quiet anticipation. Veterans sat farther forward, hats in their laps, shoulders carrying habits older than some of the recruits on the field. The commanding general arrived with the usual small orbit of aides and silence that follows rank. Commands were given. Flags dipped. Voices echoed against the cold air. Elena remained at the back edge of the stand, half hidden near one of the support beams, as if distance could protect her from being named. Tyler Beck saw her before anyone else in his row did. She stood very still, old patrol cap in one hand, the classified file resting on the table near Colonel Pierce. Even from across the distance, he could see that she was not hiding out of weakness. She looked like someone standing just outside a storm she had already survived once and had no desire to enter again. He wished, suddenly and with real force, that he could pull his laughter back out of the morning. But time is merciless that way. The ceremony began normally. Oath, welcome remarks, recognition of families, a few words about duty, service, and the privilege of wearing the uniform. The kind of language soldiers hear so often that it risks becoming background, until something real reminds them what those words cost. That reminder arrived when the general stepped away from the prepared notes and nodded to Colonel Pierce. Pierce lifted the file. The air changed. Even the new soldiers felt it, though most didn't yet know why. The general's voice carried across the field with practiced calm. "Before we conclude today, there is one correction this command has the honor to make. Some records take too long to find daylight. Some names take too long to be spoken in the open. Today, we correct one of those failures." A whisper moved through the families. The veterans in the front row straightened before the explanation even came, as if instinct recognized gravity faster than language did. Staff Sergeant Elena Mercer, the general said, formerly attached to a special operations support mission during overseas combat operations, was medically retired before the events of one classified action could be publicly acknowledged. Portions of that record have now been released. Tyler felt his stomach drop. Beside him, one of the other recruits whispered, "That's her." No one laughed. No one moved. The general extended a hand toward the back of the stand. Elena did not respond at first. Colonel Pierce walked to her, said something too low to hear, and after one long second she nodded. Then she stepped forward. Not quickly, not elegantly, just honestly. That uneven walk crossed the distance between obscurity and truth more powerfully than any perfect march could have. Her limp was visible to everyone now. So was the effort behind it. Soldiers who had barely noticed her in the morning watched as she passed under the flag with every eye on her and did not lower her head once. Tyler stopped breathing when Pierce opened the file beside the microphone stand. The wind caught the top pages and lifted them just enough for the nearest rows to glimpse the redactions, the signatures, the award recommendation, the casualty report, the medical notes. Black bars, stamped seals, a history hidden because the work had been too dangerous to name and too costly to reduce to rumor. Tyler saw only fragments, but fragments were enough. Valor under fire. Refused extraction. Recovered wounded personnel. Civilian miner evacuated alive. Silver Star recommendation. His body went still. Froze was the only word for it. Because in one violent instant, the joke he had made that morning became what it had always truly been. Not humor, not harmlessness, but ignorance standing smugly in front of sacrifice it had not earned the right to measure. The general began to read. He did not dramatize the citation. He did not need to. The language of courage, when true, carries its own weight. He spoke of hostile conditions, of a collapsing structure, of a wounded team facing imminent loss, of a staff sergeant who re-entered danger after direct extraction had been ordered because personnel remained trapped inside. He spoke of medical aid rendered under active threat, of a child shielded during structural failure, of catastrophic injury sustained while continuing evacuation of others. He spoke of survival made possible because one soldier refused to treat human life like arithmetic. By the time he finished, the reviewing stand had gone so quiet that the flap of a distant flag sounded loud. Then something happened no one had instructed. One of the old veterans in the front row removed his cap. Another did the same. Then a third. Across the stand, heads lowered. Hands rose. Silence deepened into respect. The image was so stark it seemed to carve itself into memory as it happened. The woman with the limp standing beneath a winter sky. A classified file open beside her. A line of young soldiers frozen in shame, and old men with weathered faces uncovering their heads because they knew exactly what kind of cost stood before them. That was the moment no one there would forget. Not Tyler. Not Claire. Not Mason's son. Not even the families who had arrived expecting an ordinary ceremony, and instead found themselves witnessing history step out of secrecy and into cold daylight. The general turned toward Elena. Staff Sergeant Mercer, on behalf of the United States Army, and with the approval of the review board, it is my honor to formally recognize your valor, your service, and the lives preserved by your actions. An aide stepped forward with the medal presentation case. Elena looked at it only briefly. Then she looked out at the rows of young soldiers, and for the first time that day her eyes landed on Tyler Beck and held there. He wished the ground would open. Not because she looked furious, because she didn't. There was pain in her face, and memory, and something far worse than anger for a guilty person to endure. Mercy. The general asked if she wished to say a few words. Anyone else might have prepared a speech. She had none. Elena stepped to the microphone, then stopped, as if measuring whether truth always needed amplification. When she finally spoke, her voice was low enough that the field leaned toward it. I wasn't supposed to be here today, she said. A few soft laughs of recognition moved through the crowd and disappeared. I came for a file. For answers I thought I could survive better alone. Her fingers tightened slightly around the old patrol cap. What I found was a record of a day when a lot of people were afraid, and some of them kept moving anyway. She paused. The wind lifted a strand of hair loose from behind her ear. I broke an order that day. I lived with that. I still do. Some decisions don't get cleaner with time. You just learn to carry them. Her eyes moved over the formation of new soldiers. But I'll tell you this. Pain doesn't tell you who someone is. Scars don't either. The only thing they tell you is that a battle happened. No one shifted. No one looked away. Character, she said, is what happened next. It was not a long speech. It did not need to be. Short truths tend to travel farther. When she stepped back, Colonel Pierce saluted her. Not as a courtesy, as a debt. The general saluted next. Then the command sergeant major. Then, like a current moving through the field, the entire formation came to attention and raised their hands in one clean motion. Tyler Beck's salute trembled. The sight nearly broke him. This morning he had mocked the way she walked. Now he was standing in a line of soldiers honoring the reason she could still walk at all. He felt heat rush to his face despite the cold. Beside him, the other two recruits looked stunned into stillness. After the ceremony, as families clustered in reverent little circles and officers drifted toward Elena with controlled expressions that couldn't quite hide emotion, Tyler stood rooted where he was until Boone appeared at his shoulder. "Go," Boone said quietly. Tyler looked up. "Sergeant, fix what you can." There are moments in life when a person can feel the shape of who they might become pressing against the person they have been. Tyler Beck crossed into one of those moments with his heart pounding harder than it ever had during field exercises. Elena was near the memorial path, just outside the main crowd, one hand resting lightly on the stone railing as if the ceremony had taken more from her than she wanted anyone to notice. Claire and Mason's son stood several paces away, giving her room. Colonel Pierce was speaking with the general. Tyler stopped 3 feet from her. She turned. At close range, he could see the exhaustion in her face, the residual dampness in her eyes, the rigid way she kept weight off her left side. He had thought pain looked weak that morning. Now it looked expensive. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice nearly failed him. "Staff Sergeant Mercer. I owe you an apology." She said nothing. That made it worse. Tyler swallowed. "What I said this morning, what I did, there's no excuse for it. I didn't know." For the first time all day, a flicker of steel entered her gaze. "No," she said. "You didn't." The words were not cruel. They were simple, precise, hard to hide from. He nodded, shame burning clean through him now. "I was wrong." She studied him long enough that he felt every careless instinct in himself being weighed. Around them, families murmured softly. Flags moved. Somewhere a little girl asked her father why everyone had gotten so quiet during the ceremony. Elena finally said, "You know what the dangerous part is?" He forced himself to answer. "That I laughed. That you were comfortable doing it in a uniform." Her voice remained calm. "That should scare you more than it scares me." It did. He dropped his eyes. She could have humiliated him then. Could have called Boone over. Could have named him in front of Pierce, the general, every veteran within sight. He would have deserved it. Instead, she let the silence do its work. When she spoke again, it was softer. "Learn this early, private. Respect isn't about medals and rank. It's about how you treat people before you know what they've survived." He nodded once, hard. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him a moment longer, then to the memorial panels behind him. "Good. Don't waste the lesson." That was all. No dramatic forgiveness. No theatrical condemnation. Just a chance. Sometimes that is heavier to carry. Tyler stepped back, saluted once more, and left with his face burning and his spine straighter than before. Boone saw him return and did not ask what was said. The sergeant had trained enough men to recognize when life itself had just done part of his job for him. As the crowd thinned, Elena remained near the memorial with Claire and Mason's son. The boy asked to see the old watch his mother had given her. Elena placed it carefully in his palm, and the 3 of them stood there beneath the sky finally breaking into weak, pale light. It was not healing, not all at once. People misuse that word. Healing suggests clean edges and endings. This was something quieter. Permission, maybe. Permission to stop treating survival like betrayal. Colonel Pierce joined them a few minutes later carrying a folder of approved copies from the file. He offered them to Elena with both hands. She took them, and for the first time that day, she did not seem afraid of the weight. "There's one more thing," he said. She gave him a tired look that was almost dry humor. "If another general appears, I'm leaving." Claire laughed softly. Even Pierce smiled. "No general," he said. "A request. The training battalion wants to ask if you'd consider speaking to future incoming soldiers. Not about medals. About service. About judgment." Elena looked out over the now emptying parade ground. The same pavement. The same flag. The same stretch of mourning where laughter had followed her uneven steps only hours earlier. Nothing about her body had changed since then. The limp was still there. The ache still lived in her hip. The past had not been undone. But the silence surrounding her now was different from the silence she had carried for 12 years. It no longer felt like exile. She considered the question longer than anyone pushed her to. Then she said, "Maybe not today." Pierce nodded. "Fair." She looked back at the young soldiers filing off the field in orderly rows, Tyler among them, head forward, no trace of swagger left in his walk. "But someday," she said, "I think I should." That answer pleased no one who wanted a dramatic ending and satisfied everyone who understood real courage. Grand transformations belong to movies. In life, most healing begins with a quieter sentence. Maybe someday. Rain never came. By late afternoon, the clouds had lifted enough for a thin blade of sunlight to cut across the memorial lawn, catching on granite, brass, and the edge of the metal case now tucked under Elena's arm. She walked slowly toward the gate, Claire and Mason's son beside her for part of the way, Piers following a few steps back until the path narrowed. When they reached the parking lot, Claire embraced her without warning. Elena froze for a heartbeat, then returned it with the awkward care of someone long and used to being held without needing to be rescued. "Mason would have liked seeing you stand up there," Claire said. Elena let out a breath that trembled halfway into a laugh. "He would have made fun of my speech." "Probably." The shared smile that followed was small, but real. When Elena reached her car at last, she placed the old patrol cap on the passenger seat and the copied pages of her file beside it. She did not drive away immediately. She sat with both hands on the wheel, looking back through the windshield at the parade ground in the distance. That morning, she had crossed it carrying shame, pain, and a fear that the truth would confirm the worst things she believed about herself. Now she carried something else. Not pride. Not exactly. Pride would have been too simple for a story paid for in blood. What she carried was alignment. The outer record, at long last, had met the inner truth. Mason's voice was no longer trapped inside her guilt. The child had lived. The men had come home. The order she broke had cost her dearly, but silence had cost her more. And somewhere behind her, a young soldier who had laughed at a limp would spend the rest of his service remembering the day he learned what scars actually mean. That mattered too, because honor does not only live in medals and citations. Sometimes it lives in correction, in repentance, in the moment a careless heart is forced to grow up. Elena started the engine. Before pulling out, she opened the copied file one more time to the page with Mason's statement. Her eyes found the line again with no effort at all. "If Mercer blames herself, tell her she was the reason the rest of us saw daylight again." For the first time in 12 years, she believed him. True respect begins long before the truth is revealed. And as she drove past the parade ground where strangers had mocked her uneven steps that morning, the same limp that drew their laughter had become the quiet measure of everything they had failed to see. If this story stayed with you, and if stories about courage, sacrifice, and the humanity hidden inside ordinary people still matter to you, consider subscribing and becoming part of this community. And if you felt something while listening, I'd really like to know what moment stayed with you most in the comments. Because sometimes the part that hits one person hardest is the part another person almost missed.